First, I want to welcome everybody. This is our fifth kitchen table chat. These are live conversations about the challenges that we're all facing during this crisis. Again, my name is Robert Waldinger. I'm a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and I'm the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is the longest study of adult life that's ever been done, following the same people and the same families for now 83 years. And I'm also the head of the Lifespan Research Foundation, which supports the study and also works to bring the findings of the study to all of you. So this is the second conversation we've had on these chats, and I'm delighted to have Yale professor of psychology, Dr. Laurie Santos, with us. Laurie, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just by way of introduction, as I said, Laurie Santos is professor of psychology at Yale. She's the head of Silliman College, which is a residential college, an undergraduate residence. So she is in charge of the well-being of a whole group of undergraduates at Yale. And her work has now changed the lives of thousands of people through the classes that she's developed, first at Yale, and then online, the class titled Psychology and the Good Life. And Laurie also has a podcast, The Happiness Lab, which has become a major hit and highly recommended. So don't hesitate to download it and have a listen for yourself. This is such an interesting time to talk because social distancing is challenging all of our relationships. It's challenging our health and our happiness in ways that we haven't even begun to fully comprehend yet. So today we're going to talk with Laurie about what science teaches us about happiness, about things like why we're bad at predicting what's actually going to make us happy. How we can get better at knowing where we could invest in our well-being, how connections with other people might be able to be more satisfying, and how we can think differently about relationships in a time of social distancing. So a couple of reminders before we get started. There's a recording of this session that will be available on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. The other thing is you can connect with us on Twitter at Robert Waldinger. You can also sign up for the newsletter that we put out at our website. It's www.lifespanresearch.org. Laurie and I would really like to hear from you, and we're able to take questions on Zoom or on the YouTube chat. So please text them into us, and then we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And what I'd like to do is just give you a little reporting back of the questions you answered in previous chats. Each week, we've asked one question that's the same, and that question is, what's your biggest concern right now? And what you'll see is that over the 4 weeks, things have changed. That actually the biggest concern that you all reported was a concern about family. That has not changed. 2/3 of us are primarily concerned about family, and that has been constant over these 4 weeks. But worries about isolation have increased from 7% to almost 20%. So 1 in 5 said isolation is your biggest concern right now. One of the things that's interesting is our concern about health has decreased a bit from almost 20% to a little over 10%. And concern about job and making ends meet, those are kind of lower level concerns, but they're still very much there. The other thing we asked about last week was, what are the areas of life where divisions are causing the most trouble right now in this time of crisis? And 84% of you said national politics, way more than local politics, and only 10% said that home was the biggest source of division. But when we asked you, where do you think we ought to focus in healing our divisions? almost half said person to person, and very few said we ought to work on national discussions. So it's quite an interesting set of polls. And one of the things I take away from this is that family concerns and person-to-person concerns are still what's most on our minds. We'll post some more questions this week for you to answer, if you will. So now let me turn to Laurie, to our guest. Talking to Laurie is a particular treat because Laurie really shows up personally in her teaching, in her work. As a professor, as the head of this residential college, as a person, Laurie, there were so many things that you said pointed you toward studying happiness yourself and then offering what science can teach us to people. Could you tell us some about the kind of personal aspects of what led you to devote so much of your work to this?
Yeah, definitely. And just to say, thank you again for having me on. It's an honor to be able to share with you. You were one of the first people on my podcast in the very first episode of the Happiness Lab. So it's kind of interesting full circle to kind of talk with you here at the kitchen table. But yeah, so I've kind of, long been interested in the biases that shape our mind and the ways that we get things wrong in our decision making and how we go about life. But my particular interest in happiness sort of started when I took on this new role at Yale as a head of college. And so I've been teaching at Yale for 17 years, but usually that was kind of in the front of the classroom, so I saw student life, but not really up close and personal. But as a head of college, like I'm really seeing students in the trenches. And honestly, what I saw kind of shocked me in that it was so bad. And just, it wasn't what I remember college being like at all. And so, lots of students are just feeling depressed and anxious. And at first I was worried that there was something wrong with Yale or something wrong with like Ivy League institutions. But then as I dug deeper, I realized that this is just kind of nationally what's happening like around the country, right? So, I mean, right now, nationally, over 40% of college students report being too depressed to function. Over 60% say that they feel overwhelmingly anxious most days. Relevant for your research, over around 2/3 of them say that they feel very lonely most of the time. And again, it's like, this was just sort of shocking to me. I just didn't expect this. And so the class and sort of my foray into the science of well-being happened because I really wanted to do something to like help the community. It was really like, what evidence-based stuff can I do to fix this? And one way of fixing it was to try to teach students about this content, to say, okay, like, let me just develop a whole class where I could teach students the kinds of things they should be doing to feel better. And hopefully like, a decent number of them will take it. What I didn't expect was for a quarter of the entire Yale student body to take the class. That was a little surreal. Didn't expect that one. But lo and behold, that happened. So we had over 1,000 students taking the psychology and the good life class the first time it was taught. And that was, I mean, it was surreal and cool and humbling and all these things, but it was also just showed me that students really are voting with their feet. They don't like this culture of feeling overwhelmed and anxious. They want to feel like they're flourishing too, and they want some evidence-based answers. And so that was kind of how it started. And when we realized there was such a great demand, we thought, just like you, like, well, let's, put more of this content out there for people to share. And so now we have a version of the class online for free on Coursera.org that anyone can take. It's called The Science of Wellbeing. And we've also been putting lots of content in the podcast too. But I, both on campus and beyond, was just shocked by how much people are looking to fix their happiness. And I think, there's lots of reasons for that I imagine we'll talk about.
Yeah. One of the surprises for me was hearing you talk about what you discovered at Yale, because, we imagine that Ivy League undergraduates, they've got their whole lives ahead of them, bright futures, they must be among the happiest young people.
Yeah.
And so what you found was stunning. And then, of course, we look beyond that. We look to the wider world where people are dealing with lots and lots of other challenges, less privilege, more material challenges, all kinds of situations that they struggle with. And so the fact that you put it out there on Coursera isn't a surprise. I think what may have shocked you, right, was how many people on Coursera signed up for your course.
Yeah. And so we put it online back in 2018, right when we were first starting the live class at Yale. And really soon hundreds of thousands of people joined in. It got up to, before this coronavirus crisis, it got up to about 500,000 people, which was one of Coursera's largest classes ever. But what was even more striking was that during this crisis, basically since March, we've had 1.5 million more learners plus sign up. So almost 2 million people have signed up just in the last couple weeks. And I think, again, that speaks to kind of having events like this. Like, I think, so many people are feeling anxious and scared and just uncertain right now. And again, want to do something about it. Right. And I think for our mental health, we're not giving people the tools they need. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
people know what they're supposed to do for their physical health, right? You wash your hands and socially distance. We have really clear guidelines about, okay, do this stuff and you'll be okay. I think people are looking for the same thing for their mental health right now. Like, they're feeling like everything's really fragile and they're like, okay, give me some evidence-based stuff that I can do to feel better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that struck me, particularly as you pulled a lot of the science together, was that there's something about being human that makes us bad at knowing what's going to make us happy. And what you have done is brought together a lot of the studies that show us that. I'd love it if you could just say a few things about that, about what we don't realize, what we don't understand about what's not going to make us happy and what is going to make us happy.
Yeah, in the intro for our podcast, the tagline is, our minds are constantly telling us what to do to be happy. But what if our minds are wrong? And I think
Yeah.
the sad
Yeah.
thing is that the data suggests our minds are wrong. And so I think there's a couple of features of that. So one is, the biggest thing I think our minds tell us is that the path to happiness is paved with our circumstances, right? Like, if we want to be happier, we need to get into a perfect school, like my Yale kids, like, we need to get lots of money, like, we need to switch our job, we need to find the perfect relationship partner. Like, there's some like thing out there, some event or some circumstance that we're all going after, that if we could only get it, then we'd be happy. But the data just suggests that that's simply not the case. Like, there's lots of people who exist in fantastic, incredibly privileged circumstances who are just simply not happy. And there's lots of folks who are going through a lot, objectively kind of bad circumstances, who are actually quite, like, who report having incredibly high well-being. And so that's kind of a bit of a struggle for the circumstances view. It's like, well, good circumstances doesn't necessarily deliver you happiness, and bad circumstances doesn't deliver you misery. So, like, what's going on? And I think this is a problem, right? Because we really structure our lives in ways to seek out things that improve our circumstances. But if that's not what it's about, then, I think what happens is people sort of double down on that intuition, and then it doesn't work, and so they kind of go for it more. One of the people we interviewed in one of our early episodes of our podcast was this guy Clay Cockrell, who is fantastic. So he's a wealth psychologist, which means he's a mental health professional for the super rich, the 0.1%. And, you might think that you don't need a job like that because those folks would be totally happy, but turns out they're absolutely miserable. And I think they're especially miserable because they bought into this idea that money leads to happiness. And then they get super wealthy and they're still not happy. And rather than give up that intuition, say, maybe it was something else, they say, no, I need more money. Instead of just 500 million, I need to be a billionaire. I need to, like, get a second yacht or a 15th house or something like that. And so, that from Clay's stories, I realized that, like, we just have it wrong, and having it wrong is a problem because we're still, like, working towards stuff. It's just the wrong stuff.
Yeah. And it's so I study Zen, and one of the things that I study are these stories from 8th century China, for example, where these teachers are saying to people, you keep looking outside of yourself, you keep looking to wealth and power, for a good life, and that is not going to get you there. And I'm thinking, here we are in in
Thousands of years later.
2020,
Yeah,
thousands of
right.
years later. It's all, and in some ways that's reassuring. In some ways it's okay. This the human condition is that our minds want to believe there's something out there.
Yeah.
And so what you're doing is saying, look, let's see what we really do know about this. Let's see what instead might allow us greater well-being, if not guaranteeing moment-to-moment happiness. And what kinds of things are you finding?
Yeah, well, just to know on, like, where the data come from, right? Because I think this is sort of important. It's like, well, how would you figure that out, right? I mean, what researchers do is they just go out and they find happy people. Like, they're out there, like, there's variants. We can pick off the happy ones and then just ask, okay, what are your circumstances? No correlation, right? Like, what's your salary level? No correlation. Okay, what about your behaviors and your mindsets? that's when you start to see that these happy folks look different, right? They're spending their time differently. They're thinking about things differently. Like they're behaving in different ways than the not so happy folks. And then what happens is scientists get hypotheses about, okay, maybe this is the kind of thing that works. And then you force the not so happy people to try that out. And then lo and behold, they get happier. So that is what this approach is. It's like,
Yeah.
start with the anthropology of the happy people and be like, what are they doing differently? And then when you get it, then you do randomized control trials of, try that out in some people and see what happens. And so from that work, what one thing we know, the biggest thing I think we know, is that happiness comes from being social. As you know well in your work and what we've
Yeah.
seen in the Harvard
Yeah.
study, really what we want is that we want lives of like rich social connections. We really want to find ways that we can feel close to people, that we can be around people. I mean, there's some evidence from Seligman and Diener that just being around other people is actually important for
Mm.
happiness. It's correlated with happiness. And so the research really suggests that what we need to be prioritizing is our social relationships. And I find this, again, kind of ironic, because I think in our quest for perfect circumstances, accolades at our job or the next award, or for my students, like the perfect grades, I see people going after those things at the cost of social relationships. We were just interviewing Vivek Murthy, who's the former Surgeon General. He's this wonderful new book on loneliness called Together. And he noted, like, it's not so much that we think social connection isn't good for happiness. We all kind of get that you don't want to be lonely. It's just that when push comes to shove and it's like, how am I going to spend my, Thursday afternoon? It's not, doing what you need to do to promote relationships in your life. It's often like work, and extra work and emails and whatever. But it's not like, how can I invest in my marriage? Or how can I invest in a close friendship that I haven't seen in a long time? Or, form new community connections, right? Like we're just like not putting the work in. And then we wake up one day and we're like, I don't have anybody I feel close to. It's like, well, that's because
Yeah.
you put your time and energy into stuff that wasn't that.
Yeah. I've wondered too if some of it is that relationships are so alive and therefore unpredictable.
Mhm.
And so things happen, right? And you don't always know. Whereas if I just say, well, okay, I'm going to work on this paper this afternoon and I'm going to get this section of this paper written, I can pretty much predict that I'll be able to get something done and I know what it is. And I can look back and say I did it. Whereas if I meet a friend and he tells me something I didn't expect, we go off in a direction I didn't expect to go off in. And on the one hand, that can be wonderful, but it's also a little edgier
Yeah.
to,
I think there's that for sure. And then there's also like a different startup cost, right? Like if I have a long week at work and I get home, I kind of know like, oh, I should call up a friend, but like it takes some work and I had to text, are you free? Whatever. Whereas like going on like social media or going on Netflix,
yeah,
scrolling, like it's super easy, right? And so I
yeah,
think, we also know that those things are really valuable, but we kind of don't go through the startup cost of it, right?
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that's especially true in this context of COVID-19, right? I mean, one of the things we know from the social connection work is that it's not just your close friends, it's kind of just these informal ties that actually matter a lot for connection. The chat I have with my barista at the coffee shop, or, the quick water
yeah.
cooler, conversation I have with a coworker. Like so many of us are missing those moments of positivity right now, which makes kind of the cost of starting that up again even higher, but even more important.
Yeah, like it's like what people in our field call weak ties, and it's probably not the right name for it, but it's those people you chat. Like one of my friends says that when the mailman comes now each day to her house, it
Yeah.
is a thrill. It is
You're
just
like,
the most
hey,
wonderful thing.
hi, like,
Hi.
you know,
It's like
yeah,
these, and what we realize is that these ties to people that to some extent can be invisible to us now become so important, partly because they're helping us in ways that we realize are so essential, but partly also it's the connection, as you say, just being in the same place and acknowledging each other.
yeah. My
Um,
one hope is, I think a lot about, where we're going to be at the end of this crisis and what, society is going to look like and academic institutions are going to look like. But one of the things I hope is that, this is causing all of us maybe to crave social connection more than we realize.
yeah,
And maybe causing us to realize like we didn't put enough effort into these things. I think this is coming up in the context of people who are with their spouses, right? Who, might have wanted a month or 2 months with their spouse, but now they get it and they're like, man, there were probably a lot of things I could have been working on before, I kind of dove into this. Or even just friendships, right? Where you're like, who can I have a Zoom call with? And you're like, I don't know, or
Right.
people like the opposite, right? Where it's like, I mean, I'm experiencing this too, where it's like the people I want to reach out to during this time are like the old friends. It's like my
Mm,
college
mm,
roommates who I have a close relationship with, or my mom who I was close with before, but like now we're like zooming every week, to get dinner together and stuff. And so I think this crisis is going to put in stark relief, first of all, just how important our social relationships are, but specifically those social relationships we miss the most. And the hope is that once we're out of this crisis, we'll realize that and actually put in the time we need to kind of do more of making sure those connections are prioritized in our life and so on. Like, I think a lot of us are forming these good habits of using technologies to connect with people who are far away. And hopefully those habits will stick around kind of after the crisis too.
yeah, yeah. I am surprised at how much technology can help us feel connected, can help me feel connected. Like, I mean, I work as a psychotherapist. I see people every day in therapy, and I'm used to seeing them face to face. But I'm surprised at how much we can do, and how good it is to be with each other on Zoom. Much better than I thought.
I
So
mean, one of the things I've been trying to do personally and like sharing with my listeners and things too is like trying to be mindful about how you use this technology, of what feels good and what doesn't, right? Like definitely like, a spa night with my college roommates over Zoom, or like a yoga class with like a friend who's in a different time zone or something. That feels fantastic. But sometimes the Zoom, you can get to like the Zoom overload, like sometimes
yeah,
like work meetings and stuff. And so I've been trying to say, okay, like mindfully process, like, how did that feel? Was that kind of a nutritious social connection or not? I sometimes, for the podcast listeners, use this analogy of like nutrition when we're talking, there's food that's delicious, but it might not be that nutritious. And I feel like that's true of this social interaction over technology. Like, you can have the kind of sugary, nasty parts, but like, what are the nutritious parts? What are the parts that are really building you up and making you feel better? And how can you add more of that in? And similarly, like, what are the parts that like don't feel good? Because there are definitely things that feel social, scrolling through an Instagram feed or something like that. Like, it feels
right.
like you're being social, but actually it just kind of makes you feel gross.
Yeah, and I think we don't know enough yet about those elements that are really different about in-person interaction. There's something about emotional communication for sure, but I don't think we fully understand how that works, or what it is that can't happen through screens that happens in person. But I'll tell you, when I take a walk with my friend at a social distance every Sunday, I just, sometimes I get a little tearful because it's like so great to be together in person, even though I'm with people all day long in Zoom meetings.
Yeah,
It's not the same.
totally. We have this, my favorite coffee shop just started doing like curbside pickup, so you can
Yeah.
order it ahead, but you see the guy kind of through the window in the plexiglass, and I was like, my barista, like, right there. It's like in real life. And so, yeah, but I think, I mean,
Yeah.
again, technology is the best we have, and there are definitely parts of it that feel good. And I think, one strategy is just pay attention to how it feels for you. And it might
Yeah.
differ for you than for other people. I've had folks say, what's nutritious for me is a one-on-one conversation, kind of like you and I are having. I mean, there's like millions of people listening to this probably, but like you and I are having this one-on-one conversation, that feels good. But a Zoom window of like 8 people starts to feel distracting. Other
Yeah.
people have mentioned, technologies where I can't see myself are helpful. Some people find Zoom and sometimes Skype exhausting because they're kind of like, peeking over at themselves and
Right.
what they look like and stuff. And so you have to experiment with it, and that experimentation takes time, but again, it's like it's an investment that's so worth it to protect yourself from loneliness, to feel connection in this time of like, or in a really challenging time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that idea of investing is something that we've gotten clearer about in our work, that, relationships, there's a startup cost, but then there's also a maintenance cost. There's maintenance effort, right? It's almost, I mean, I really liken it to exercise. It's like
Yep.
I don't just get to work out once and then I'm done. I'm all good after that. And but often we think about that. I mean, we think about it with marriages, with friendships, with, that they'll take care, that the marriage will take care of itself as we just go about our busy days. And of course, we know that that doesn't happen,
Right.
and that perfectly good relationships can kind of wither on the vine. And so I think trying to understand what the kinds of investments are, how that works, and what's needed over time repetitively is something that I think we're learning more about, hopefully.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I think you need to kind of make some sacrifices that I think are really critical. I mean, one of the sacrifices is just time, right? Like relationships just take an investment of time, right? And that, if we're spending our time only on, work or like on, just scrolling on Reddit or something there's going to be an opportunity cost there. I think another thing
yeah.
relationships take is kind of, some sacrifices in some small ways, right? Like I'm realizing, especially in this crisis where I could just, be glued to panic scrolling right now, it's like for the people in my real life who I see, my husband who's like, living with me right now, like I have to put the phone down and away, right?
Yeah.
Like we forget the power of these other technologies to steal our attention away. And so, good relationships take attentiveness, and that means fighting all the distractions in our life too. And so,
Yeah.
again, I think it's I love the exercise analogy because like it takes work, and it takes work, continuous work. It's not like you do one leg day and you're done, right? Like
Right.
that
Right.
continuous work is so worth it, especially right now in this challenging time when, I think the crazy thing about this crisis is whenever we're facing a challenging time, there's like a couple features that are weird about this. Like one, usually when we're facing a challenging time, it's just us. So if I have like a really crappy week at work, my husband doesn't necessarily have a crappy week at work, or my best friend doesn't necessarily have a crappy week at work, right? So like I can seek out them and they're kind of a little bit more resilient than I am. But
Yeah.
what's weird about this crisis is like we're all going through this horrible, crappy time at once, right? A second weird thing is like usually what we want to do when times are bad, and this is like when collective times are bad, when there's like a hurricane or like some sort of scary event. Like I remember back at 9/11, it's like you want to see your friends, right? Like you want to go back to normal social activities, like get brunch with your friends or like go get a drink, or I want to see my mom or whatever. But we can't do that, right? And the
Mm,
most insidious thing is that in this crisis, other people are like a threat. Even when I, put my
yeah.
mask on and I go for like, walk down the street or something, I see people and it's kind of like a person, like,
I
like
know.
I could
I
get
know.
sick, and so,
I know.
so this virus it's smart. It's really hitting us where we need to be resilient, which is through our social
Yeah.
connections.
Yeah. The other odd thing about needing to wear masks, which we need to do, is that we can't see each other's expressions.
Yeah.
So that I find myself walking down the street and smiling at people and realizing they don't know that
They
I'm
can't see it.
smiling.
You're like, yeah.
Because this emotional communication is done so much through the face. So wearing masks handicaps us in yet another way.
Yeah, I was
Oh,
talking to colleagues who work in the healthcare profession, even who are on like COVID wards and things, and they say that that's one of the worst things about it is these people are, their patients are afraid and so on, and they can't even like, especially with all the gear and the PPE, it's just like they just kind of barely see people's eyes. And so, again, in this time where you really need connection, people are kind of alone. But again,
yeah.
this is why these technologies can be so powerful. Even they're saying that they try to like meet with the patient from outside the room, or they'll have a talk over the iPad so
Yeah.
that when they go in with their mask off, people can see who they are. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so I think we can get really creative, but that
Yeah.
creativity takes work. And I think it's worth knowing that the science shows that that work is incredibly worth it for everything, but including for your immune function, right? I mean, there's so much data
Yeah.
suggesting that loneliness can harm our immune system, right? So ultimately, it's not necessarily washing your hands, but it's another good thing you can do to protect your physical health right now too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things I was interested in is when you talked about all the ways we can be distracted, and we have to literally like learn to put our phones down and turn to whoever we're with and give our undivided attention. But and you've talked about this idea of time famine versus time affluence.
Mhm.
And I wonder, like, do you see all of that changing in this lockdown period, or is it really the same? Is it all just, are we still starving for
Yeah.
time, just in different ways?
Yeah, I think it really depends on your situation. Like, I mean, I think academics are facing this now. I have some colleagues who are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm baking bread. Like, I have time to hang out with my partner." Those tend to be the ones without kids, by the way. But then there's
Yeah,
other academics who are like, "I'm drowning. Like, I'm a babysitter and a teacher, and I like have my other job, and I'm my students."
yeah,
So I think there's a lot of variance there. But I think one thing we're learning is because we're kind of here and some people are off work and things like that, I think we're learning the value of different kind of priorities. Like what leisure looks like when you're not like doing your go-to thing. What does it look like to really closely hang out with your family members or do something with your spouse in a really close way? And I think I think a lot of us are learning different strategies for how to do that well, and
Yeah.
experiencing some of the challenges of that too. But yeah, I think one thing people are experiencing when you get some time affluence, which is kind of ironic for those of us that have a little bit more time, and put myself in that category, not having kids, is that when you are a little bit more time affluent, you want to end up being more social. This is some lovely work by Ashley
Yeah.
Williams and colleagues. One of the reasons time affluence, which is just this subjective sense that you have a little bit more time, that's what time
Yeah.
affluence is. One of the reasons time affluence helps is it makes us a little bit more social. When we're like frantic at work and our friend calls and says, "Hey, do you have time for chat?" We're like, "No, I gotta like
Right.
deal with this
Right.
deadline. Like, get out, don't text me." But I think feeling time affluent means we want to be a little bit more social and can open things
Yeah.
up a little bit. And so, if you have a little bit of free time, one of the best ways you can spend it is to try to find other social connections.
Yeah.
And it's also worth remembering that social connections can come not just through like, a chit chat with a friend, but really trying to seek out ways to be a little bit more other oriented generally. Like, how can you help somebody in terms of like in the middle of this crisis, right? Like, how can you actually reach out and do something nice for someone or volunteer your time? Or if you have a financial windfall, which some of us have because we're not like paying for our commute, like the subway or the gas, or some of us aren't even buying our morning coffee, like what can you do to use that money in a really productive way? And so those kinds of moments of doing things for other people are a powerful way to feel a little bit more socially connected, like different than the normal way we can
Yeah.
about call a friend, but incredibly powerful in this time. And just in and of themselves, doing nice things for others we know can improve your well-being over time.
Absolutely. And thinking about a way to use that time, if we're not accustomed to having free time, discretionary time, to use it toward connecting with other people and giving to other people is one of those investments in happiness, you're saying.
Totally. And I think this is another spot where our minds lie to us a lot. And it's one of the reasons I think people are getting so like kind of pent up in quarantine is that we're not good. We don't have good theories about how to use our leisure time. Like a lot of us think when I have leisure time, I'm going to do the most like, I'm going to sit and like scroll through Netflix or like,
Yeah.
I'm going to sit around or like, but the data suggests that leisure that feels good, like kind of nutritious leisure is leisure that really challenges us. I think that's why people are kind of realizing like so many people like baking and baking bread and things like, people are making like sourdough bread, which is like kind of hard to do, like, and so people are realizing that these challenging activities feel better. And so there's some data that, people, when people think they have free time, they predict they're going to want to sit around and like watch Netflix or do nothing. But in practice, people kind of hate sitting around and doing nothing. And
Yeah.
so kind of finding activities during this quarantine that feel a little bit more challenging than you'd want, that feel like they have a kind of startup cost, like those are the things that are going to make you a little bit happier right now, more so than just kind of doing nothing or just lounging around. Like we need
Yeah.
kind of active leisure, especially if you're not working, because
Yeah.
people have this incorrect theory that they have less fun at work. But if you actually ping people at work, most people report being actually happier at work than they are at leisure. And the reason is that like work is kind of challenging and you're kind of getting a little bit more flow from work. But we don't structure our leisure time to have that. And so,
Yeah.
like learn a language or learn an instrument or, bake bread or like do even like playing games, like board games with your family, like do something that has a little challenge component to it is
Yeah.
really good advice right now.
Yeah. I'm hearing about a lot of Scrabble games going on.
Yes. Yeah. With friends and stuff. There's also
Yeah.
lots of games you can do, like that people are coming up with that you can do online too, like through a Zoom window with friends. So you can set up the same Scrabble game, or there are different like Jackbox TV is one that my friends and I are using, which is kind of like this online video game that you play over your phones together. And so there are ways to do that challenging, fun game stuff and be social, even with people who aren't in your house.
Yeah. Great. Great. Um, One thing, just to report back on the polls, family is still the top concern for the people answering that question, and then we asked the question during this crisis, what's your greatest source of well-being? And connecting with others was the top response by far, and then physical wellness was the second response, and both of those fit right in with what from
Great. Yeah.
all
Great.
the yeah.
For the people, when they really reflect, can figure out the answer. When they're really being mindful about what's the nutritious way to spend their time right now, people
Yeah.
get it, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the next moment. And I know that myself, when I've watched myself in this crisis, because I think all of us are kind of going up and down, right? Like, and sometimes in my down days, I'll just realize like, I'm not doing the right stuff. And it's nice to have a whole team of people that are helping you with some of this.
Yeah.
Like I have my producer, Ryan, who helps me on the podcast, and he'll kind of be like, well, let's see, did we exercise today? Like, did we talk to you? Like, have you walked outside? And I'm like, like I'm supposed to know this, but it's still hard to implement it.
Well, that's what I think, I think that is so important, that we need to remind each other, right? Like these are things, like the back of your hand now, right, Laurie? But
Totally.
sometimes you need other people to remind you. And I am exactly the same way. I don't know anybody who doesn't get lost at times and kind of lose track of what actually they do need and what actually might make them feel better. So I think having other people who can remind us and ask us, have you gotten your
Yeah.
exercise today, is really important.
Yeah, my producer is great like that for me. And he also, so another tip I give my listeners is about kind of, this is a yucky situation, right? Like it's worth validating that this is really hard for a lot of people, but we're still in control over our reaction to it. Like we still control whether we deal with this tough situation by, eating a bunch of chips and feeling nasty, or like, calling a friend, right? Like we get to control a lot of our own behavior. And I use this parable of the second arrow, which you probably know well from your Zen Buddha studies. The idea is Buddha was talking to his disciples and said, is it bad if you get hit with an arrow on the street when you're walking down the street? And his disciple said, yeah, that sucks. And he said, well, is it worse if you get hit with a second arrow? Like you get hit with 2 arrows instead of 1 arrow? And his disciples say, yeah, like second arrow would be much worse. So Buddha says, the first arrow is your circumstances in life. You don't get to control those. That's whether you're in a pandemic or, whether you lose your job or whatever. But he's like, the second arrow is your reaction to those circumstances. And you always get to control the second arrow. Like there's always something you can do. And so luckily, current modern day phones have emojis of arrows. And my producer, Ryan, is kind enough that when I'm not, when I'm not doing myself favors with the second arrow, when I'm like stabbing myself actively with
Right.
they'll usually send me little 2 emojis of the arrows just to remind me. And I'm like, okay, yep, totally. Like I'm in control, like not gonna stab myself anymore. So it's useful to have friends who will tell you, who will put you straight.
Yeah, and to remind you, of the second arrow. Like, so there is suffering, right? There's the pandemic, there's bad stuff that happens to us. But then some of the suffering we layer on top is optional. That's what you're talking about. And other people can help us see it and maybe step a little away from it.
Okay.
All right. So let me see if there's some more poll results that they'll give us. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is you have these wonderful rewirements in the course. It's a pun, it's a riff on requirements, but it's a way, what you do is you ask your students to go do an action that they don't normally do, and then to experience what it's like to take one of those actions that we know tends to make us happier. And I think what you've done so well is to emphasize the importance of behavior change, that we can just tell each other what will make us happy, and that isn't gonna move us really.
Yeah.
That it's actually walking the walk. It's behaving differently. And I wondered, at this point, have you found ways to think about continuing that behavior change? So you walk your students through a set of behaviors, and they get to see, wow, this was different, and I actually got something out of this. And then how are you thinking about kind of sustaining change over time? Because that's the hardest thing for so many of us.
Me too. I think for humans, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the dirty secret is that we as psychologists have lots of interventions that help people. We have a harder time getting people to stick with those interventions naturally. But the good news is there are some ways. And so one of the ways is to turn it into a habit, right? And so habits here are just defined as these automatic behaviors like driving a car where you don't really have to think about it. Most of the folks watching this probably have a teeth brushing habit, I hope, which is like, you don't really have to decide, like, am I going to brush my teeth this morning? Am I not? When are you going to do it? You just like have a time of the day that you probably tend to do it, and
Right.
cues that probably help you do it. These happiness interventions work best when you can turn them into that, the kind of
Mhm.
thing like brushing a teeth, where it's kind of like you just do it and you don't really have to think about it. And I think one of the nice things about doing the rewirements over the course of a whole class that, exists across 13 weeks is that some of these things really became habits for students. Like, if you do meditation enough, it's like that's just what you do when you wake up in the morning. And so it becomes a little easier. I think the second thing that we know allows us to achieve behavior change is social support, right? So if you tell people you want to do it, or if you have a friend who's going to exercise with you, or if your partner is asking you, so what were you grateful for at the dinner table? Like those are the kinds of things that help habits stick, and that help behavior change stick. So I think, find ways that you can
Yeah.
support these positive behaviors through allowing your family members to know about it, through helping your kids. Like for me, my students will love to call me on like when I'm not doing the right thing, so that's
Yeah, yeah.
like a great form of social support. But I think the final thing that we know from behavior change work that can be really powerful is the strategy of mindfulness. It's like taking time to notice how you feel after stuff, and that's like the good stuff, like, oh my gosh, I just had this great chat with Robert, and after this is like, I feel much better. Like, oh, like that was a good thing. That was nutritious. Let me build this back in. Or like I just spent a half hour, scrolling, for no reason on Reddit, and I feel kind of nasty afterwards. Like what the mindfulness does is it allows us a kind of gut check about, was that a good rewarding thing to do, or a thing I should get rid of in life? And that can be incredibly powerful for kind of making us realize that this habit isn't as good. We know this from some work in cigarette and in the craving literature, that if you get people to really focus, cigarette addicts say to focus really on how the cigarette tastes and like what it feels like in your mouth and stuff. People are like, I never really actually focused on it, but it feels kind of nasty. Like I don't really want to do this anymore. And so by
Mhm.
focusing on your own habits, both good and bad, it can
Right.
really help you pay attention to what matters.
Absolutely. The other thing is useful is that it gets you to tune in. We know that one size doesn't fit all. And one of the things you do in your happiness course is you have people sample different things. And you're not assuming they're going to make each one of those things a habit, but that they're going to check in with themselves. And they're going to find that some things really are a fit for them, and that they might be able to carry those forward and make those into habits and get a little support group around those. And that the other things they can let go.
Yeah, I
And
think that's critical. Like, not all of these interventions are going to work for every person. In one of my podcast episodes, I interviewed Sonia Lubomirsky, who's an expert on, a
yeah.
lot of these happiness habits. She's, whole papers on gratitude interventions. And in the podcast, she was like, "Yeah, I just don't really like gratitude. It just feels kind of hokey." Like, I'm like the person who has papers on it, right? So things are going to resonate and things are not. And
Mhm.
so for you paying attention, you can kind of see what works better.
Yeah.
Part of it is like some things you're doing naturally, so kind of bumping it up isn't going to help, but there's some things that you need a little bit more help with. And so I often tell my students, focus on the stuff that feels not as natural to you, because those might be the ones where you'll get, you're doing it really low, and so you'll get this kind of bump up if you start adding in those interventions now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Laurie, this was great. I could go on a long time, but we probably need to come to a close. And I wanted to ask you this question because I ask it of myself all the time, and I ask it of other people. Like, if you can just think about your biggest hope for how we all emerge from this, like just quick association, what would it be? What would you hope happens for all of us as we get out of this?
Yeah, I really hope that this whole crisis has caused us to realize how much stuff we were taking for granted, like how much
Mm.
stuff we were completely adapted to, from the ability to get a latte, to see people's faces on the street, to just, knowing that you probably weren't going to catch a horrible virus. And I hope that when we get on the other side, we're just going to have incredible gratitude for stuff that we were taking for granted before. Like the first time I can plop in a coffee shop and take my laptop out and just start working without a mask or worrying I'm going to get sick. Like, I hope I just experience the sheer joy that I should from that event and from everything, like seeing my mom and giving her a hug, like, going to a grocery store and being in line next to
Yeah.
somebody and talking to them. Like, there's so much that was just not like guaranteed in life that we missed before. And now I think when we get those things back, I hope we'll realize just what a gift they are. And if we do that, we'll just increase joy so much for so many people.
Yeah, yeah. That because once you don't know what you've got till it's gone, that famous
Yeah. And again,
Janis Joplin line.
none of us would have said like, let me have a horrible, pandemic, a deadly pandemic to like bump down my hedonic adaptation. But like now that we're all going through it, we really are going to get this interesting benefit in terms of our gratitude once we get out.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. Well, Laurie, this has been a great gift. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you.
And
Super fun.
I just wish you and all your loved ones and all your students health and safety, and looking forward to the time when we can be together again in person.
Yes, ditto, ditto. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.